What's up? I am David Long. I'm here today to talk about idealism. I am going to watch a video by Bernardo about his small theory of everything. Bernardo Kastrup.
At the Future of Brain Health Symposium only a couple of days ago in Amsterdam, I gave a presentation that encapsulates a clean, quick, brief summary of my philosophical views, of my ontological views. And what I wanted to do now is to give you a new edition, a new spin of that presentation, in which I have a little more time to talk about the details, but still keep it simple. I call it my small theory of everything. Small because it's quite simple. The difficulty in it is just to overcome our implicit built-in assumptions and prejudices about the nature of reality. But if you can take that small shift in perspective, what I'm going to talk about is actually very simple, almost in your face. So here we go, a brief introduction to my small theory of everything. And of course, we start from this big question, this big mystery in science today, which is the mind and brain relationship. It has been chosen by Science magazine in its anniversary edition in 2005 as the second most important unanswered question in science. The first question being the nature of matter. I would say it should have been the first question, the relationship between mind and brain, because whatever we say about matter is conditional, is dependent on this fundamental relationship between mind and brain. All of our knowledge is in mind, after all. Now, that there is a relationship between mind and brain is clear. We can stimulate in certain regions of the brain, which leads to marked changes in our subjective experience of reality, in our emotions, in our thoughts, and so on. Psychoactive drugs have an influence on the brain, and they change how we feel subjectively about life, about ourselves, about the world. Brain trauma has a marked effect on our inner life. So that there is a relationship between mind and brain is empirically obvious. And many people take it for granted that the brain generates the mind, like the liver generates bile, that the mind is the product, the outcome of brain function. The problem, however, is what is called in philosophy and neuroscience the hard problem of consciousness, which is that there is nothing to the properties and dynamics of matter that allow us to deduce the qualities of experience. We do not even know how to think about how the feeling of seeing red, the feeling of loving someone, the feeling of being afraid, how any of those subjective experiences can arise out of mass, momentum, charge, and spin, the properties of matter. There seems to be an unbridgeable gap between these two worlds.
This is one of the things that you notice. Whenever you talk to somebody from a worldview, they have a strict narrative around their way of thinking about things. Like, look at these Trumpers. You see consistent patterns. Every time you talk to one of them and you bring up something, they have the same defense.
Fake news. Fake news. Fake news.
And the way that these idealists always talk about science is as if it's some kind of a dogma or some kind of way of thinking that people just take completely uncritically. People just accept it without thinking. They just take it for granted. It's just a dogma. It's an ideology. They'll use all kinds of words, especially religious words.
Bernardo himself never says that science is a dogma. He never uses these words like doctrine or anything like that. He does talk about emergentism as magical thinking, but he's really careful around the science thing because a lot of his case relies on appeals to authority and trying to equate what he thinks with science. So he wants to walk a really thin line here around science. He wants to, on one hand, imply that these people are just taking things for granted or are caught up in magical thinking, but on the other hand, he does want to be able to appeal to science, scientific papers, and scientific authorities where it suits him. And he's also an academic and a doctor, so he's going to be real careful around some of this. A lot of times other people go really hard on this point.
We'll see a little bit later when we get to the part with Deepak Chopra that this is definitely something that he does.
We have to stop being the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science.
This is something I've seen a lot, but Bernardo's definitely playing it safe, being very careful about his language around some of this stuff. He talks about it like
our implicit built-in assumptions and prejudices about the nature of reality. And many people take it for granted, an appeal to magic.
But the truth is that the reason these are the dominant theories is because science has had to work real hard against the status quo, which was a more religious, idealistic way of thinking about the world, for a real long time to prove and establish itself. So when people talk about dogma around these things, it's like they don't know what dogma means. Dogma is something that is handed down, that is to be accepted without question, without skepticism, without doubt. You just believe it. And let's be real, science is not dogma. Scientific knowledge is not something that people just believe in. It's not a belief system. And the conclusions that people have come to as the dominant theories across multiple disciplines is because of explanatory power and hard work and proof and evidence. So if the general community of science at this point in the development of science history come to a consistent conclusion about something across multiple disciplines, it's probably because there's pretty good firm reasons and evidence to come to that conclusion. People will point to things in the past where science got things wrong, but in general, those are not things that science got things wrong. Those are points where science learned and we moved forward as a species. And just the fact that they can prove that science proved it wrong and got better is just proof for science that it can refine with peer review over time and that bad ideas get weeded out. So something to look out for, this idea that science is dogmatic. Let's also talk a little bit about this hard problem of consciousness, which is basically, we don't know how you get experience out of just stuff. It doesn't make any sense to us. And they're always like, where's the mechanism? And it's like, that is not how it works. It's not even just stuff. It's like the same thing with this video that we're watching. It's not that it just happened one day and there's a single mechanism for it. The way that it was possible was because it's an emergent property of all of these different factors coming together. And no one thing on its own would have made it work. It's like this God of the gaps argument.
There seems to be an unbridgeable gap.
Well, there's the hard problem. How do we get these things out of these simpler things? There are explanations to be had, but it's not like purely material even, because part of how we're able to experience things in reality is because we have concepts and social programming, ways of talking about our experience that make us more than just billiard balls hitting up against things. There's interpretation. So there's experience and interpretation. Basically, from an integral perspective, if you're wanting the answer to how something like consciousness works, and you're only willing to look at exterior factors to be able to explain interior phenomenon, you're never going to get the answer because you've set up a problem that's impossible to answer. You're basically asking how the upper right alone can explain the upper left, and that's always going to be a reductionist answer.
Imagine if a person had never seen movies or videos or computers before and you tried to show them this stuff. They'd be like, how does the camera capture these images? And they would look at the hardware of the computer and they would be like, how do you edit this video with this device? How do you go from these little weird computer chip things to editing videos? Show me the device on here that allows for you to edit videos. I don't understand. Point to it. It's like, well, that's not really how it works. Maybe then you would pull up the code, the binary code, the software that allows for the video editing program. And that's all ones and zeros. They're like, what? Tell me how you get from ones and zeros to a video. That makes no sense to me. That's like magic. It's like, yeah, it is kind of like magic, but it does work in a particular practical way. So even though you get to experience all this amazing presentation that's happening in this video, all of these realities, all of these emotion-evoking images in rapid succession, all of these new worlds generated in a way that would be considered magic to people who don't understand what is going on, can be explained practically. Not in terms of a reductionist approach to just hardware or just software. These things alone cannot fully explain this emergent phenomenon, which is actually the outgrowth of all of these systems coming together. And the same is true for consciousness. We may not have all the answers yet, but we do have plenty of answers. And in general, we know that this is the case. Sure, there are some gaps in our knowledge, but not gaps so big that you can fit these ridiculous idealistic theories within.
There is nothing to the properties and dynamics of matter that allow us to deduce the qualities of experience. We do not even know how to think about how the feeling of seeing red, the feeling of loving someone, the feeling of being afraid, how any of those subjective experiences can arise out of mass, momentum, charge, and spin, the properties of matter. There seems to be an unbridgeable gap between these two worlds, and it's known as the hard problem of consciousness, and it has not been solved, and we have not made progress towards solving it. Now, there are at least two mainstream hypotheses about this relationship between mind and brain. The first one is what's called emergence, the idea that consciousness, subjectivity, is an emergent property of the brain. There are many instances of emergence in nature that are well known. For instance, the fractal patterns of snowflakes. We can even simulate the formation of snowflakes on a computer. So in every known instance of emergence, we can deduce the emergent property from the characteristics of the lower level components of the system, except for consciousness. We cannot deduce, not even in principle, how it feels to see red, how it feels to love someone, how it feels to be afraid, from the mass, charge, spin, and momentum of the subatomic particles making up the brain. As such, to say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain is the mere labeling of a fundamental unknown. We just gave it a name and we feel warm and fuzzy as if we had explained anything. Nothing has been explained.
This dude acts like scientists have been doing nothing on this topic, like we have no data on this topic. It's dishonest. This is dishonest, what he's saying right here. Like, we have definitely mapped emergent phenomenon to equipment, and we have one-to-one correlations. Destroy parts of the brain and functions are lost. This whole, like, there's no information or data, we know nothing about how this could work. It's very, very similar to the way that Christians talk about evolution. The parallels are all there.
Well, if evolution is true, then why are there still monkeys? Which they think is a good question, but it isn't.
These people are basically denying evolution, because evolution and emergentism are the interior and exterior sides of the same coin. The map of the interiors of consciousness correlates to the development of beings over time through evolution. So to be like, oh, we have no idea how this happened, it's just a God of the gaps argument.
Alternatively, it's an appeal to magic. We are basically giving a name to the magic arisal of subjective experience from allegedly dead matter. It's an appeal to magic, and again, it doesn't explain anything.
So science knows nothing. They're basically talking about magic. Their beliefs are equivalent to magic.
First, let's get rid of the scientists. If we can dismantle science and not talk about science, and not have to deal with facts or evidence or logic about how reality works, then my theory and ideas work just great.
And like so many of these idealists, like,
I have my mathematical proof for God. I have my logical case for why God is real.
it's like it's always some shit like this with these people. And the only people who that's at all convincing to are people who already really want to believe it. No one's trying to falsify this thing and prove it. They're all trying to make a case for it. That's the difference between real science and pseudoscience, by the way, is that real science will try to disprove something, to falsify something, to knock something down to see if it stands up.
But we tried this on, we tried this on, tried to kill like this, and we prove that this thing will stand under any of these circumstances, no matter what you do to it.
That's science. As opposed to this.
Well, I found this. This idea could prop it up nicely. You just gotta ignore this, ignore this.
These people are not doing good integration. They're trying to make a case for their ideas. They're frantically grabbing for things that look like it could fit. The way to go is try to disprove every idea. Only take the ones that really, really stand when you're really critical of them. Who cares about what you want to believe in? Let's figure out what's actually true and good and align ourselves with that.
The problem is so serious that some materialist philosophers, in order to get around this problem instead of solving it, have proposed with a serious face that consciousness itself is an illusion, that the brain computes that it is conscious, but it isn't really. If you think about it, this is absurd. I can create a computer program that creates a variable called conscious, and then after very complex calculations, attributes the Boolean value true to the variable conscious, such that conscious is true, and that will not make the computer any more conscious than otherwise. The manipulation of symbols and the attribution of values to symbols doesn't make anything conscious. This is so obvious. Consciousness is the only carrier of reality we or anyone can ever know. Knowledge resides in consciousness. What has never been in consciousness in anyone's mind might as well not exist. To say that consciousness is an illusion is an absurdity. It requires an arbitrary redefinition of the word consciousness in a way that is simply not what people mean when they say consciousness.
It's not what people mean when they say consciousness. Well, guess what? Most people don't know what consciousness is. Is that a fair assessment of what's going on? Most people don't understand what consciousness is. So who cares what most people mean when they say consciousness? What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the ability to be self-aware, to know what our feelings are, to perceive ourselves and the world around us. They're saying consciousness is an illusion. What they mean is consciousness as this idea of a soul or a true self or a spiritual essence is an illusion. So This is a problem with what consciousness even means. What do you even mean when you say consciousness?
So when Bernardo says,
I can create a computer program that creates a variable called conscious, and then after very complex calculations, attributes the Boolean value true to the variable conscious, such that conscious is true, and that will not make the computer any more conscious than otherwise.
so how is what he's saying about this computer any different from what these scientists are saying about us?
Consciousness itself is an illusion, that the brain computes that it is conscious, but it isn't really.
How are we any different from this computer that after complicated calculations, we just associate the idea of consciousness with true? It's the same basic idea. And we only have the equipment that we're working with to be able to interpret our experience or to be able to be conscious of anything. To be conscious of something means that you're experiencing it and aware of it. So that means you're using the equipment you have, like your eyes and your ears and your brain and the concepts you have through social conditioning to interpret your experience. And we call that consciousness. So this is the combination of different factors, biology, relative meanings and values that come out of living in environments that shape what becomes our experience of consciousness. It's not that consciousness is primary, it's that consciousness is the emergent quality of all of these different factors coming together.
Tell me, what is love?
Love is first widening my eyes a little bit and quickening my breathing a little and warming my skin and touching with
And so on, exactly so. Thank you, Sheila.
They're saying what you think of as conscious is an illusion. It's a type of software run on the brain, and it is like a bunch of concepts related to feelings and experiences. That's what consciousness is. It's an emergent property. Your biology and your interpretive filter that you've learned come together to interpret your experience, and you build a narrative around that, a concept of self. You recognize yourself, that things in the world are happening to you. This is all concepts. This is all ideas. And without these ideas, one isn't said to be conscious. And there is no self. It is a concept. It's like free will. It's not real. To really be awake, to really be conscious, is to some extent assume that you know what's going on in reality, that you're actually perceiving what's happening, that you're aware. And most people aren't aware. To say, how can you deny consciousness? It's like, who do you think is conscious? Who do you think is really awake and aware? Who do you think really knows what's going on in this context? I don't think you do, Mr. Bernardo.
And when Bernardo says,
what has never been in consciousness in anyone's mind might as well not exist.
Here he's reducing everything to personal experience and completely negating context, the context in which conscious beings have come to exist, as if development and evolution aren't real or don't matter. Here's a supposed scientist saying that what we don't know about may as well not exist and doesn't matter. When have you heard a scientist talk about the unknown like this?
Man, have you guys noticed the cringy background music too? It's like, I'm telling you the secrets of the universe. Snowflakes, you guys. Snowflakes. Okay.
So the mainstream hypothesis can be reduced to either the labeling of an unknown, an appeal to magic, in which in both cases nothing is explained, or absurdity, like the idea that consciousness is an illusion.
So yeah, like I said, almost anytime you argue with an idealist, they don't start by being like, okay, I looked at all the evidence, I tried to figure out what's going on, and when I really look at all the things that are happening in the world, and I've really, thought out from the ground up what might be going on, let me tell you my case for idealism, how I come from this idea of I think therefore I am and other people exist, to this conclusion that idealism in this kind of way. They don't do that. What they do is they talk a lot of ish about science and what other people think, and they call it magic, and they call it a make-believe worldview and all this other stuff, and then they offer their idea as the only reasonable alternative. They don't make a good case for their view. This guy did this talk at some kind of Deepak Chopra thing. Deepak Chopra loves to have this guy on because he confirms his worldview, and in a seemingly scientific kind of way. Like, he probably calls him Dr. Bernardo because he wants him to be a doctor and he wants this to seem like really legit and scientific and all this kind of stuff. Part of the reason why even I'm not really respecting a lot of authority and lots of other people aren't respecting a lot of authority is because people like this guy will get on a stage and speak with all kinds of authority, like he's a doctor. He'll get up on a stage and he'll say some stuff and he'll seem like,
oh my god, this guy's doing some groundbreaking, amazing stuff. He's like above and beyond what the simple, normal scientists are doing. He's doing this like way outside the box. Like, whoa, he really gets it, man. He really gets it.
and he'll talk like he really gets it because he thinks he really gets it, but he doesn't.
I want to take a step back.
Let's stick to what we know.
From all this conceptual analysis that we have been doing, and just stick to what we do know.
And then tell a bunch of stories around it.
The brain generates consciousness. We only know that there is a relationship between the two, composed of atoms, force fields, and whatnot. The brain, just like the rest of the universe, is just a physical system. So what nature seems to be telling us is that if there is a first-person perspective correlated to that object we call a brain, and there is no reason not to believe, not to infer, that there is also a first-person perspective corresponding to the whole of the universe.
Why would we jump to that? Why would we jump to that? Are we just going to assume that every complicated system is a person? Why would we jump to that? Oh, because it's an important step for him to be able to establish his dumb idea. Okay, first premise? No, I reject your first premise, which is never good. Well, if the brain is a system and it has a consciousness and it has a first person correlated to it, then any complicated system is probably a person. It's like, no. Are you going to say that your computer's a person? Are you going to want to do that?
The manipulation of symbols and the attribution of values to symbols doesn't make the computer any more conscious. This is so obvious.
No, you're not.
That there is something it is like to be the whole of the universe.
Oh, is there?
The universe as a whole is itself the second-person perspective of a first-person experience at a universal level, at the level of mind at large, as I like to call it, or a cosmic consciousness, as my friend Deepak Chopra likes to call it.
Deepak Chopra.
A universal mind, so to say.
Universal mind.
Now, I am not the only one to be open to this hypothesis. I mean, mainstream physicist Lee Smolin from the Perimeter Institute, in a book he published a couple of years ago in 2013, he was quite open to this, and I'm quoting him here.
Oh, here's something. Here's somebody. I found somebody. Hey, I'm not the only one. Here's someone else. He's an important person. He's a scientist. He thinks that maybe I'm right about this. There's one guy, and he's a scientist. So even though I said scientists all believe in make-believe bullshit, when it suits me and they agree with me, I'll bring out a scientist. Look, I got a scientist to prop up my thing. Are we trying to falsify our ideas to see if we stand, or are we desperately grasping for straws to try and find somebody who agrees with us?
He's open to the idea that consciousness is the intrinsic aspect, or the first-person perspective of a system that we call the brain, and that the universe as a whole may also have an intrinsic aspect. In other words, may also have first-person experience, and that we are basically living within a cosmic nervous system. And then you might say, well, Bernardo, this doesn't really add up.
What about, well, Bernardo, that's just what one man said, and you're just another one man, and just because two people said it and said, hey, I think it could be like this, doesn't really mean anything. That's not good evidence for your philosophy. How are we 11 minutes into your presentation and you've only made one premise?
The brain is just a physical system. If there is a first-person perspective correlated to the brain, then there is no reason not to believe, not to infer, that there is also a first-person perspective corresponding to the whole of the universe.
Which I've rejected because it's ridiculous. It just really seems like you either have to be like not that intelligent or like really wanting to believe to be able to buy this. That's not 100% true. Let me step back from that for a second. There are people who definitely have not learned how to think critically. And I know that spiritual experiences can be incredibly powerful, and the narrative around them can be incredibly powerful too. So it's not like these people don't have any good reasons from a human perspective, not from an epistemic perspective, in terms of like, it makes sense that a person who had had these experiences, who had heard these stories, would come to these conclusions. And it also makes sense that most of us have not been taught how science works, the scientific method, or how to be skeptical. And so it makes sense that a lot of us would be ill-prepared to be able to see through this kind of bullshit. But man, let's keep going.
And then you might say, well, Bernardo, this doesn't really add up. It doesn't look at all like a nervous system. It doesn't look like a brain. It's like discrete chunks of matter floating around in the vast distances of space without anything really connecting them. There are no synapses. There's no network in the universe. It doesn't look like a brain.
Here he's like setting himself up. Oh, you might say, the universe doesn't look like a brain. No, I didn't say that. That's not what I said. I was critical of your actual logic. Now he's going to show a picture of the universe looking like another picture of a brain, and he's going to be like, see, that proves it.
Consider this. We are very tiny creatures. We are
Who hasn't
the world
seen these
around
pictures?
us, even the universe we can see with our telescopes, is a tiny fraction of the whole of existence, of the whole of the universe. This would be equivalent to our being microscopic little people sitting on the edge of a synaptic cleft in the brain, the connection between two neurons. What would happen if we could zoom out in the universe at large and look at how the universe is formed at the largest scales? It would look like this. You see, we've computed how the universe looks like at the highest scales, and it looks like a nervous system. You see here a comparison between a simulated image of the universe at very high scales and neurons in a mouse's brain.
I could show you a similar image of a city. Does that mean a city has consciousness? You see what I'm saying? This is some causation, correlation, far-sighted mishmashing. This looks like this. See? Like, this is the level of argument we're dealing with here. Oh my gosh. I find this to be pretty embarrassing. Let's continue on.
And you see that the pattern of interconnections are very similar. This is not only a visual comparison, and you might claim I have just chose the pictures in such a way as to make them look alike, and it's a cheat, it's an illusion. But there has actually been mathematical study of these patterns of clustering and interconnection, and it has been demonstrated that indeed the universe at the largest scales seems to obey unknown laws that just make it look like and grow like a human brain.
Look, I found this over here. It's also going to prop up my thing. Look, I found 3 things to prop up my thing, see?
I found a study that shows that a city works and grows like a human brain. I found a study that shows that a computer works and grows like a human brain. Maybe my computer is conscious. Maybe this city is conscious.
It's like, dude, these are such pathetic, stupid arguments. This is his case for idealism, you guys.
Demonstrated, although the reasons for
as above, so below. That's the level
underlying
of logic we're dealing with here.
Okay, we just are able to infer that they are there because things really look similar. And then you might say, well, Bernardo, if the whole universe is one nervous system, one mind at large, one cosmic mind, one cosmic consciousness, so to say, why is it that I have a separate, tiny, disconnected inner life? Well, at the conference, I have appealed, because the attendance of the conference was composed of doctors, nurses, people involved in clinical care and healthcare in general, people with clinical experience. And I used this metaphor of dissociative identity disorder. This is a condition formerly called multiple personality disorder.
I found something! This could work to support my theory. Look, this identity disorder, that works to support my theory. It's like pure grasping for things, mishmash cluster of, I'll make it work, I'll find the pieces, I'll find a scientist who will say something like it. It's building a case. There's no logic and evidence here. This is pure storytelling. Oh, I found something that looks like it could work. I'll take that idea and then just assert that that's how the universe works, because look, here, that's how this works.
In which the patient develops multiple personalities, dissociated personalities, that are also called alters. And these dissociated personalities often are not even aware of each other. And when they are, they often don't like each other and they want to hurt or kill each other. They are quite dissociated, quite separated. They don't share the same memories. They don't share the same preferences, the same goals. They're highly dissociated in memories and preferences. And yet they are unquestionably all part of the same psyche, of the same person. Now, these alters, they take turns in time, controlling the person, so to say. Now, space-time is an integrated unit and is an integrated entity, as we know since Einstein, since the general theory of relativity. So it is entirely conceivable that there might be alters in space as well, alters in space-time. And the hypothesis that I want to put forward to you is that what we call life is a dissociative process in this universal consciousness, in this universal mind at large, just like dissociative identity disorder. Each living creature is an alter, a dissociated personality with its own memories of mind at large. And living bodies, metabolism, biology, is just the image of these dissociated alters of mind at large, of this cosmic consciousness. To give you some intuition about this, let's make a comparison here. We are able today to put a person with dissociative identity disorder under a functional brain scanner, an fMRI, and we are able to identify in the person's brain these little processes here, neural processes, that are correlated with the dissociative identity of the person, with the dissociation of multiple personalities in the person. So these neural processes are the image of these dissociated alters in the person's brain. This is established today.
Well, this is established today. No. This is pure assertion, my dude. You have established nothing.
What he's actually talking about here is that this is a fact about multiple personality disorder, but he keeps on trying to associate things that are established facts or actual science, and the fact that they're established or that they're science, with his theory being true. Just because multiple personality disorder is real and true doesn't mean that the universe has it. This logic is basically something like, if one thing happens on one level, we should see it happening with everything on every level. And that's just crazy. Like, there's no reason to think that's true. Making reference to things that are proven or known in your argument makes your argument seem like it's good, but the logic around how he comes to his conclusion isn't good, so this premise doesn't matter. In general, I think that there's something manipulative about what he's doing here, because this is exactly the kind of thing that's confusing and convincing to people who don't follow logic well. Basically, if you call yourself a doctor and you speak with authority around something and you say words like "this is well established" and you make assertive claims, people start to believe what you say. Even if it's technically true and unrelated to your point that the thing that you're saying is so well established, just the fact that you're saying that a factor of what you're talking about is so well established in your talk and saying this is absurd and this is so obvious and all these kinds of things, there's a lot of very manipulative speech in this thing. And it's done in a way that seems safe and there's plausible deniability. Like, if you go back and look at what he actually said, it's technically true, but it's just manipulative. Manipulative language with plausible deniability. And that's basically a lot of what Bernardo is doing. That's kind of his whole shtick.
We are able to identify in the person's brain these little processes here, neural processes, that are correlated with the dissociative identity of the person, with the dissociation of multiple personalities in the person. So these neural processes are the image of these dissociated alters in the person's brain. This is established today. Now, if the universe at large is a kind of brain, is the second person perspective of a universal first person inner life, first person experience, set of experiences, then it is entirely logical that if mind at large has dissociative identity disorder, we should also be able to find the images of the dissociative processes in mind at large. And my contention is that we can find them. They're us. You're looking at one right now. I am the image of a dissociative process in mind at large.
So what is the image of a dissociated process in my computer? If I can find one, does that prove it has a personality, that it's a being in itself? What about the mind at large in a system like a forest? All of its trees are dissociative alters and it's a larger being. It's like where are you drawing up the lines of things? Like, this shit is just crazy. It's just like, well, how can we make a scientific sounding case for Hinduism, where it's like, we'll never say Hinduism, we'll never say enlightenment, we'll never say spirit.
The S word, which I try to avoid.
We'll talk about mind at large instead of the grounded being, and we'll talk about dissociated identities instead of saying archetypes in the mind of God, or that we're all just versions of God. I mean, there you go. Now we're vibing with the whole New Age community here. They're like,
oh yes, we love to just grab things that work to support our worldview and cram them in there. Look, here's another doctor-looking sounding guy who is saying something that I already agree with, who will support the things that I already want to believe in. Let's definitely plug him in.
This dude is considered to be one of the serious, mature philosophers who has a good argument and good case, a rational case for idealism, and it's pure storytelling.
If the whole universe is one nervous system, one mind at large, one cosmic mind, one cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, well, if ifs and buts was candies and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. Tell him that.
How lame is this? Let's keep going.
You are the image of another dissociative process of mind at large. A mosquito, a bee, dissociative processes in mind at large. Plants and vegetables, they may be images of the beginning of this dissociation, the early stages, not yet complete, but the beginning of the dissociation. This is what life is. The image of dissociative processes in mind at large.
These people, they always end up arguing, God has multiple personalities and he loves to masturbate, but the world was conceived in love, you guys. The world has meaning and purpose. It's like, oh my God, you're trying to do this because you think it's beautiful and it has more value, but you're arguing that God has multiple personalities, and that's the point of reality. This is not a beautiful, meaningful thing. Not only is it wrong and disempowering, it's actually stupid when you think about the beauty that these people are trying to maintain with their stupid ideas. People don't want to believe that they're just another part of the universe, that they're just stuff. They desperately want to believe that there's something more, that there's something else, that there's a greater plan, there's a greater meaning. It's like, no, actually, there's no good reasons or evidence to think that. Part of growing up is just realizing that these fairy tales and these mythologies about higher purpose and some ultimate plan or some ultimate being, it's just stories because people can't cope with life. They can't cope with the fact that they're going to die, that their life isn't part of some kind of plan or doesn't have any kind of purpose except for the purposes that we make for ourselves. But you know what? It's coming to grips with this adult real world ish that actually makes you start to be a more responsible, worthwhile, and awake person. He's kind of grasping real hard to this crutch and this security blanket so that way he can feel like everything's okay. Everything's meaningful. We're not just stuff, you guys. One day we're going to return home. We're going to return to our source. Mommy and daddy will love us. The universe is conceived in love. Everything's good, you guys. We're not just some accident. We're not just stuff. We're not just out here on a rock floating endlessly through space. It's all meaningful, you guys. It's all for a purpose. It's all for a great plan.
That being the reason why we think that we are separate from the rest of the universe, that we have our separate, private, inner lives. We are simply dissociated. We are authors of mind at large.
And that makes sense to an extent because we know we're connected and we forget that we're connected and we act as though we're not connected, right? So it's like this resonates really well with a lot of the Buddhist metaphors, and a lot of the Buddhist metaphors are true. They resonate really well with like the existentialism, deconstructing kind of metaphors, where it's like there is an important truth in this. But then these storytellers come and they use these experiences or correlate these experiences to these large conclusions that are just like a reach on top of a leap, on top of an assertion, like just ridiculous. Let's continue.
According to this view, if I look out to the inanimate universe around me, composed of rocks and moons and stars and nebulae and galaxy clusters, all of that are images of non-dissociated processes of mind at large as perceived by me, an alter of mind at large. They are indeed outside me as an alter. They are outside my dissociated complex of mind at large, but they are not outside mind itself. They are not outside consciousness. When we say that there is a world outside, it means outside the alter, not outside mind itself.
Well, can you reassociate and then disappear? Do that and I'll be impressed. This brings it back to that question of, okay, it's not falsifiable. Okay, well, what's the practical value of it? Hey, you think you're a dissociated alter. Well, why don't you show me what it's like to actually reintegrate or associate with something and let's see what that actually looks like. Oh, you can't? Okay, so how is it helpful to know that? Oh, it's not? Okay. What's the point of all this? The goal is what? To wake up as God, but still you'll always be a dissociated alter? How is there ever a real awakening in this context? Is it even possible? What does that mean? How come you always stay dissociated? Or does he think that if you fully awaken that you disappear? How is this helpful or good or true? It's so stupid.
There is no need to postulate a world outside mentality.
There's no need to postulate a world outside of mentality because everything exists in God's mind. So basically, this is just a linguistic trick, an argumentative chess move, like I was talking about before, like science isn't real. Okay, so everything's happening in mind, so there's no world outside of mind. These are just like broad strokes, like large leaps of logic and straight assertions that allow him to dismiss huge aspects of reality and science. Oh, we don't need to listen to science. That's just dogma. Oh, we don't need to postulate a world outside of mind. So all that stuff is just blah, 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 blah. Like Christians who are just like,
oh, no, evolution, it's not true. We've never seen evolution. Evolution doesn't happen.
This is the level of argument. Name calling and storytelling. That's all this is. There's no valid logic. I don't think I've agreed with any of his points, nor does he have any evidence, nor does he ever try to falsify any of it. It's a Nick-off joke. A person who talks like this in public, if they are a doctor, should have their doctors revoked. Their school should disavow what they say publicly.
When I see other living creatures, other human beings, cows, dogs, cats, flies, plants, algae, bacteria, I am seeing the image of other dissociated processes of mind at large. All non-dissociated processes in mind at large, in other words, the inanimate universe, are just the images of subjective experiences. They are the second-person perspective of experience, of first-person experience. And the views of an author, my experiences of the world and other living beings, they are also subjective perspectives as far as I can know. Subjectivity is the only carrier of my reality that I can ever know.
So science is out because, hey, that's just a person's subjective experience. Forget about peer review and our ability to develop technology over time because we do actually know objective facts about how the world around us works in a consistent and coherent way. No, it's all just someone's subjective perspective. Can't trust it, but all my logical jumps and leaps, that is like solid.
So everything is then subjectivity. Everything is mentation.
Everything's
With this idea
subjectivity.
of dissociation. We
Upper
can
left
explain the
quadrant
fact that the
reductionism.
world seems-
Hey, we don't need these exterior quadrants. Yeah, maybe we can even get rid of the lower left quadrant too. It's all just God, all mind at large, everything's subjectivity. This is not an integral view, people. Why would you want this? Why would you want this as a worldview? I don't get it. I ask, why would you want this? Because it's clear to me that he wants this to be true. This is not the best, most reasonable theory there is to be had. He must want this, but I don't understand why he wants this, because it's so unhelpful and stupid, and it makes life so pointless. Basically, the goal of life is to disappear with these views. Buddhism too. Stop the ride. I want off. I want to disappear. I want to cease to be. I want to kill my ego. I don't like that at all. I think that's super unhealthy. So not only wrong, not only stupid, not only completely unfounded, but also psychologically problematic and unhealthy. So yeah, not a big fan.
And if there is no universe outside consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness just disappears. It melts away like butter under the sun.
Hey, if there's no universe outside of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness just disappears. That's how we deal with these things. We just pretend like, hey, if reality doesn't exist, then we don't have to deal with the problems of science, and then we can just sweep all that under the rug and ignore it. No problem. It's just easier. I mean, if only you exist and there's really no landlord, we can solve that landlord problem and you just not pay him. There is no spoon. That's going to work real well, Neo.
Because the hard problem arises from, one, inferring a universe outside consciousness, which is an abstraction of consciousness itself, and then trying to explain consciousness from that abstraction of consciousness. This will never work. We are just chasing our own tails at light speed. But if all there is consciousness, then consciousness is the ontological primitive. And the entirety of reality can be explained as just modulations, excitations, vibrations of consciousness alone.
Okay, well, let's stop there. Here we are 21 minutes into your talk, and you're saying, well, if consciousness is the ontological primitive, why don't you make a case for that?
If ifs and buts was candies and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas.
Where is your logical case for that? It's not impossible that one might come to this conclusion, but you have done none of the steps to get us to this conclusion. You haven't started from, I think, therefore I am. I don't know what's going on in this universe. I don't know what is happening, to establishing logic and reason and being able to look around the world or in your consciousness or with whatever tools you have to be able to come to conclusions about the nature of reality, to be able to understand your experience in that context, to be able to prove the conclusion that consciousness is the ontological primary. You have to actually get to that to establish that. You have to actually make a case for that. You don't just get to start with that as an assumption. We've seen no case for that. We've seen him say,
the brain is just a physical system. If there is a first-person perspective correlated to the brain, then there is no reason not to believe, not to infer, that there is also a first-person perspective corresponding to the whole of the universe.
well, if complicated systems are a person, then every complicated system should be a person, which is a stupid first premise. That's your argument for how consciousness is the ontological primary? A stupid first premise like this?
The idea of a world outside me arising from dissociation in consciousness, not from a world outside consciousness. You may ask, well, these ideas sound kind of new agey and crazy and unreasonable and non-scientific, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Nothing.
There has been a paper published in Nature magazine, you can see here on the top.
Here's something. I found one. Here's a scientist who thinks something that looks like what I'm saying. See? It's scientific, you guys. Look, there was a time when a scientist said something in a journal about this. Sort of, probably, maybe, kind of. And I found a sentence in there that really supports what I think. My positive case for emergentism. It's like, well, how do we know that there are other minds? Well, how do we know that peer review works? It's like, well, we proved that it works. We have the proof that it works. And if it didn't work, science wouldn't work. Your computer wouldn't work. Your TV wouldn't work, because reality doesn't work in a consistent and objective kind of way. Like, there's a case that I can make where I can say, look, we tried to debunk it. We tried to prove it wrong, but it proves to be true. It stands up over and over again. And that's how you're able to have a cell phone, a TV, and we were able to put a man on the moon. Where is Bernardo's case that says something like that?
Where's Bernardo's man on the moon? What has his theory contributed?
Where it's like, oh, you think reality works in this kind of way? Well, let me show you how I can prove it. Empty claims. Storytelling He's putting up his flimsy worldview based on nothing, some things that he could grab and some far-sighted mishmashing and bad logic, and he's putting that up against what hundreds of thousands of people have built together through a rigorous process over hundreds of years. Our best theories that have had people attacking them and criticizing them from every angle, and still they stand up and rise to the top over a huge long process. And he wants to put his flimsy little stupid hypothesis up against the most valid theories that work across multiple scientific disciplines. It's like a joke. Look, I found a scientist. Shut up, man.
Volume 436 in July 2005, 10 years ago almost.
Had to dig back through the records, through the archives for over 10 years to find something that looked like it would prop up my theory, and had to ignore so many arguments to the contrary to find something that supports what I'd really like to believe, so I can grab this needle out of a haystack to make what I'd like to think seem scientific by saying, look, I found a scientist who said something like that. It's so ridiculous.
Published by Professor Richard Conn-Henry from Johns Hopkins University, in which he basically bit the bullet and he said the universe is entirely mental.
He bites the bullet. It's a secret. Everyone in the scientific world, they all know it's true. They just don't want to bite the bullet and admit it. This is like manipulative, dishonest language. This guy, Bernardo, he is a con man. He might be a philosophical con man, but he is a con man. His speech is manipulative. He has no good points. This is not a logic-based argument. This is a case for what he would like to believe based on what he can scrounge up. This is not scientific. This is not rational. This is storytelling propped up by things that he could find.
And he didn't say that because of philosophical preferences or philosophical rationale. He was just aware of experiments in physics that seemed to be leading to this conclusion. Let me explain this a bit. If the universe were indeed outside of consciousness, this would have certain implications that could be tested in laboratory experiments. And they have been tested. The results contradict this idea that things exist independent of our conscious observation of them. And this is what motivated Professor Conn-Henry to arrive at this conclusion. He went further, even said that many physicists try to go around this implication of the experiments, and they try to find very complicated, tortuous theories to save this idea of a universe outside consciousness. And what he says is that this is counterproductive. It doesn't generate any new physics. It just perpetuates the illusion of a universe outside consciousness. And he finishes his paper in a quite spectacular way. He even uses the S word, which I try to avoid.
He tries to avoid using the S word spirit because he doesn't want it to become so clear that what he's selling is dressed up scientific looking spirituality. And what is the great contribution that this idea that the world is all mental has contributed to physics? Where are the evidence of those great contributions? You notice that he says, oh, this has all been debunked. Where? Based on what? If that's the case, why didn't you start with that? How is it that we're 23 minutes in, like towards the end of your talk, you're saying that there's all this evidence in that debunks the stuff, and yet you're just now telling us? I don't understand. He doesn't want to get into it because he knows, like this guy said, that scientists don't agree with that ish. And this guy has a fringe opinion too, who's also influenced by the same Eastern idealistic sources that Bernardo is probably influenced by. These aren't original ideas to any of these guys. So the fact that he could find one other scientific paper that thinks some of this stuff and has these ideas probably on the back of a bad interpretation of quantum physics, they're like, oh, see, that disproves materialism. No, it doesn't. It just shows that things work different on a lower scale of reality. Doesn't debunk Newtonian physics or anything like that. Let's continue.
But he basically concludes the universe is immaterial in the sense of not being outside consciousness, not being outside mind. He bit that bullet fully. Now, this was 10 years ago. In the meantime, in the last 10 years, many more experiments in physics have been done, trying to find those things that would be consistent with the idea of a universe outside consciousness at a microscopic level. And just to show some references to you, I'm not going to go through these, I just want to mention them. At least 4 new papers, one only a few weeks ago in 2015 by Manning and et al., in which they tested those things, and they realized again, confirming again, that the universe doesn't behave in the way one would expect it to behave if it indeed were outside consciousness.
There's no details here. These are claims, and he's saying, here, you can go look them up. Here's the sources. And he's pretty much banking on the fact that you won't go look any of these things up. Yeah, this is all non-local quantum stuff.
So this is actually where I want to take a moment and talk about Deepak Chopra. Remember, Bernardo came out with this talk at a conference hosted by Deepak Chopra. So let's just rewind back to 2010, when Deepak Chopra tried to bring up a lot of these ideas, especially related to quantum physics, in a room with a bunch of actual scientists.
In deference to Sam Harris, he said, don't go the way of quantum physics. I think I'm going to have to say that science is now in a process of overthrowing the superstition of materialism. That everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material. That the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. Call it what you will. And science also tells us, and if there are any scientists who want to disagree with them, please come up during the question and answer session. Science tells us that nature is a discontinuity, that it's an on-off phenomenon, that there are gaps between every two ons, where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be? Science also tells us that there's a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything, God is explained by neurology. Well, I hope today, Michael, that you will convert from a skeptic to a neuroskeptic, because your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and in the dungeons of orthodoxy. Today, science tells us that the essential nature of reality is non-local correlation. Everything is connected to everything else. That there's hidden creativity. There are quantum leaps of creativity. That there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy and matter. We can have a personal relationship with this intelligence, because we have a consciousness that is part of the sea of consciousness. And all you have to do is understand the principles of science and understand that you have within you the resources to intuitively grasp this mystery. But one of the things we have to do today, my friends at Caltech, you have given us this opportunity that you have to stop being the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science, which is not relevant anymore.
You asked what I meant by woo-woo. That is the very embodiment of woo-woo. He said, stringing together at a rapid patter a bunch of scientific-sounding words sprinkled in with some spiritual New Age words doesn't mean anything.
I hope that scientists here in this audience.
By the way, scientists are not jihadists here. This is Caltech. We're not jihadists. That was really very unspiritual of you. This non-local quantum effects, we're all connected. No, this is not true. When quantum physicists talk about non-locality and the interconnectedness of things, they're talking about things at the quantum level.
And there's no reason to think that it's active at the level of the brain.
When you talk about the observer effect and the uncertainty principle, this is how subatomic particles are altered by looking at them, by bombarding them with light, for example, because they're so small. And so you look at it or you don't look at it, and that changes the nature of what you're looking at. But the moon is really there whether you look at it or not. It doesn't apply to the macro world.
In the absence of a conscious entity, the moon remains a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup. That you have to have a conscious being.
The moon?
Yes.
Okay, listen to the sounds in the room.
Well, I guess Bernardo's moon landing is out then.
The deeper point here, and this is where the whole style and content of what you're saying is so deeply unscientific, is that there's not a physicist sitting on this stage right now. Okay, I would never be tempted to lecture a room full of 1,000 people at Caltech about physics. I'm not a physicist. You're not a physicist. And basically every sentence demonstrates that you speak on the subject. Now, please don't take this as ad hominem, but what you do and what many people who try to invoke spooky physics do in the service of propping up their religious and new age intuitions is that they think that because quantum mechanics is spooky and difficult to understand, and because what you're saying is spooky and difficult to understand, they must somehow be related, or they must somehow be mutually supportive. And that's just fundamentally not true. They're arrived at by completely different methodologies and ways of thinking and criteria of discursive evidence. I've studied with great mystics. I've met great meditation masters who've spent 20 years in caves, perfecting the kinds of techniques of meditation that you would adopt or recommend. They don't know a damn thing about physics. And they're not interested, for the most part, in physics. I mean, there's nothing about sitting in a cave and, granted, having incredibly useful and even normative experiences and transforming your way of life and transforming your moment perception of the world. There's nothing about that project that makes you a theoretical physicist. These are completely different language games, and you have just merged them together in a very unprincipled way. This is a game. It's a game that is designed for export to people who don't know much science and don't know how science is done. You're not a theoretical physicist. The way science is done is
I invite theoretical physicists in this audience to actually address these questions.
Okay, so a theoretical physicist will be comfortable talking with real confidence in a very narrow band of his expertise, and he will be exquisitely sensitive to the fact that whenever he opens his mouth in a room like this, he is guaranteed to be speaking in front of half a dozen people who know more on any given issue than he does. The great irony of the popular conception of science as arrogant is that when you go to a scientific meeting, you're about as likely to see real arrogance as you're likely to see nudity. People are constantly offering caveats and hedges toward what they said. Every statement is couched in, I'm sure there's someone in the room who knows more about this than me, but because everyone is desperate to avoid public embarrassment. And this seems to be something you're not doing.
If I was worried about being embarrassed, I wouldn't be actually influencing the people that I'm influencing.
And so, Leonard, you are a quantum physicist?
I'm a theoretical physicist, and I'm also writing a book with Stephen Hawking. Would you like to have a short course in quantum mechanics sometime so that we can straighten out your misuse of quantum notation?
What is it about Deepak's use of quantum physics that bothers you?
The term non-local, the use was not correct.
I think consciousness is non-local.
Yeah, you know, I've never really run across a definition of consciousness that I understood. So maybe you could teach me something. And
A superposition of possibilities.
Okay, well, all right. I know what each of those words means. I still don't think I know.
I mean, you see where it would come from, right? Because quantum mechanics says what the world is different than what we see when we look at it. So it's a small leap from that correct statement to we bring the world into existence by looking at it, right? And then you're Deepak Chopra. And Deepak he's found me on Twitter, so whenever I tweet something about quantum mechanics, he retweets it with something, but it's all in your mind, it's all consciousness bringing the world into existence.
He loves word salad. Yeah. That guy is the biggest dealer of word salad that the world has ever known.
And the genius is putting the word salad into a recipe that people think is nutritious for them, right? they really like to eat, even though there's no actual nutritional value.
A friend of mine gave me a Deepak Chopra book, and I started going through it, and I was like, you know this guy's crazy, right? Like, I mean, he probably wants to do well. Like, he's probably not a terrible person, but he's also ignoring the actual scientists that study all this stuff, and he's pitching this thing, this sort of like pseudo quasi-spiritual view of the world. But the reason why Deepak can do that is because most people don't understand what he's talking about. I see what you're doing. You're throwing a bunch of very complicated words that aren't in most people's vernacular, and you're saying them in a way that makes me feel like you have some sort of a connection to the chi and to the chakras and to the inner whatever that everybody's trying to reach to be happy.
Yeah, and another problem is just that whenever there is a field, whether it's physics or medicine or whatever, where we know something, but it's hard, complicated, counterintuitive, when we explain it, we translate it, right? In physics, we have mathematical equations that are quite unambiguous as to what they say, but then we use words. We say, well, there's a cloud, there's a probability, etc. And every translation is inaccurate in some sense. So if you're basing your beliefs off the translations, then you can fudge them a little bit more to get almost wherever you want to go.
So at this point in history, it might just be a well-known fact that Deepak Chopra is the go-to archetype of New Age woo and nonsensical word salad.
Have been subjected to a kind of word salad of scientific jargon, used out of context, inappropriately, apparently uncomprehendingly.
I would like to remind you that ad hominem is a logical fallacy, and that's Science 101. You should know that.
Ad hominem means talking about a
This
person
is my
as an
turn to
individual.
speak, sir. Okay? You accused me of jargon. You accused me of misusing language. How many people understood what I was saying?
You're lying!
Since this debate that he had with Sam Harris and Michael Shermer, it doesn't really seem like he's learned more about quantum physics. What it seems like Deepak has actually learned is to surround himself with people who can look like they're doing real science or seem like they're actually intellectual and appealing to real science. Instead of relying upon the hopefully sympathetic theoretical physicist in the audience, Deepak is going to provide his own pseudoscientists to try and make reasonable seeming cases for his worldview. And that's what Bernardo is. And I bet it's actually a pretty great deal for Bernardo because through hooking up with Deepak, someone who's really famous, I bet it brings Bernardo a lot of attention, a lot of fame, and potentially even some wealth.
I have today a wonderful guest that we're going to add to this series, which has been very exciting, Bernardo. We have had Nobel laureates, we've had Don Hoffman, who we know, and Mena Skafatos. Recently, I had Frank Wilczek, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and also Brian Keating, who's the head of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Imagination.
We are in excellent company.
Yeah, they're excellent company. So today, I'm so happy to have you. So first of all, welcome.
I'm happy to talk to you always, Deepak. It's a pleasure.
So this is all just talking about non-locality and quantum physics. He's just like, this disproves materialism. It's like, no, it doesn't. I'm not hearing a good argument for that. We're not even hearing that argument. We're just hearing the assertion of his conclusion, and he's pointing to these things as evidence without really getting into it. I don't want to bog down my talk with evidence and proof and good reasons. You just take my word for it, okay?
The inevitable conclusion is that the universe is entirely mental, and therefore we are dissociated authors of this mind at large, whose second-person perspective is the inanimate universe we see.
So that was his entire case. Pure assertion, a couple appeals to authority, a few things he was able to grab up from scientific-looking sources, and hey, this looks like this, so this, bad logic, causation, correlation, fallacies, begging the question all over the place, circular reasoning, pretty pathetic.
Now, what are the implications for healthcare?
Implications for healthcare. I think he's just going to go on to argue that we need also interior methods of healing, not just exterior methods of healing, because we know about placebo effects and all this kind of stuff, right? And I don't disagree with that at all. I actually do agree with that. But I think the problem with this kind of thing is that people who think like this then start arguing things like, well, if you're sick, it's your fault because you think bad. Maybe you need to change the way that you think about things then, so that way you can actually be healthy. Stuff like this. And I mean, it's not to say that some of that stuff isn't true, but we also could potentially get into victim blaming with that kind of stuff. And that's not good either. So I think I'm not going to go any further into this. There's nothing good here. There's not a single good argument in this thing.
And when Bernardo says,
to say that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain is the mere labeling of a fundamental unknown. We just gave it a name and we feel warm and fuzzy as if we had explained anything. Nothing has been explained.
Bernardo is such a hypocrite. At the end of the day, he literally has no good evidence for his ideas. It's pure storytelling, and he's going to talk about giving something a name and then feeling warm and fuzzy about it without actually having established anything. This applies to him and what he's doing way more than it applies to science. Just like what they're talking about is dogma and orthodoxy, way more than that applies to science. These guys are constantly dragging science and our most valid theories down to their level as an insult, while they do it themselves, but worse.
See, one person getting it really, really wrong in a bold kind of way can actually confuse a lot of other people, and they can pass on their bad ideas like a mental virus. He's doing some harmful stuff here. In this case, and in many other cases, it seems pretty clear that the people are actually influenced by some religious idea, but they don't want to say the S word.
The S word, which I try to avoid.
You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're out here pretending to be a scientist while you're peddling religious ideas. I'm not into that. So with someone like him, it may not seem like the pre-trans fallacy, like he's not necessarily advocating for a religious dogma, although he kind of is. He just isn't explicitly telling you that's what he's doing. He's trying to make a reasonable seeming case for it. And he is taking that myth literally. And it is clear from the way that he talks about this thing in reasonable sounding terms that he believes in this myth of us being archetypes in the mind of God, and he's looking for a literal way to describe it. They want to act like it's literally true, and that's exactly what he's doing. There's nothing transrational about this. If he was saying poetically, metaphorically, hey, we're all archetypes in the mind of God. God is the universe. We're all aspects of the universe in flux. We're all interconnected. We're all part of the universe. We're all out here playing these parts out and relating to different aspects of ourself in time. I'd be like, okay, that's fine. That's valid poetry. That's true. That's a helpful way to look at our experience. All good. You start actually taking that poetry literally and wanting to make a literal case for how we know it's literally true. It's like, whoa, man, you've gone too far. That's pre-trans confusion right there. It's not literally true. It's poetically true. Come back to reality and maybe start to re-include science.
So at the end of the day, we've seen that Bernardo has 0 good points. None of his ideas stand. They're all like as above, so below, and this looks like that, appeals to authority, circular reasoning, assertion, storytelling. And we've seen what happened. In 2010, Deepak Chopra got schooled by a bunch of people who actually do real quantum physics. And instead of ever learning, all he did was surround himself by people who will look like they're scientific and appeal to science and act like their ideas are reasonable. They really care more about the narrative that they're crafting than they do about the actual truth, about peddling these ideas that they have built an empire around, than they do about what's actually true. These guys are not trustworthy. They are con men. They are profiting off of this idealistic, religious, new age bullshit. This stuff is superstitious nonsense.
Thanks everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe and ring the bell and like the video and buy the merch. Support on Patreon, like all of my other beautiful Patreon supporters who I love the most. Join the I Am David Long Friends and Fans Facebook group where all the good conversations are going down. Watch the next video, all the calls to action. Thanks very much. Peace!